If I were to ask you, which item do you think was the most influential item in the history of our realms, what would you say? Would you say the Deck of Many Things, with its incredibly powerful enchantments and predilection towards random chance? Or would you say the Bag of Holding, simply because of how useful and ubiquitous it seems to be? After all, no great adventurer would be caught dead without a Bag of Holding, or even one of its similar counterparts. Maybe you'd go a bit more aggressive and say the Holy Avenger types of greatswords, such as the Karsamir that was found in a red dragon's hoard that are wielded by only the greatest of benevolent paladins. Well, the thing is, at least in my opinion, that none of these even come close to claiming the title of most influential item in the realms. In fact, at a glance, the truth appears to be much more mundane. First, let's decide what it means to be influential. We live in a world that's absolutely overflowing with all sorts of things, and first among them is arcane magic. We've gone over the history of magic, so I'm sure you're quite aware of just how magic seems to permeate nearly everything in Faerun. We've discussed the nature of the weave and how, when a mage casts a spell, they essentially pluck a thread from the weave and spin it to create what could be considered a new pattern. And this is all well and good, but have you ever wondered where much of this arcane knowledge stems from? How did mages over the course of tens of thousands of years create, and more importantly maintain, a relatively cohesive standard of spellcasting? Well, this is where the influence of our topic today comes into play, because what could possibly be more influential in our world today than the ability to access the font of power known as the Weave, and use it with proficiency and expertise? The Nether Scrolls, originally known as the Golden Skins of the World Serpent, is the name given to two sets of 50 scrolls that dealt with the fundamentals of magic theory. Yes, you heard that right. There were indeed two sets of these scrolls during the Days of Thunder. It's said that the second set was transformed by Faerunian elves and turned into what they would call the Kes Ar Teranthiar, or the Golden Grove of Hidden Knowledge. However, I will note that today's entry will predominantly focus on just the first of those sets, because the other set had quite a different fate compared to the set we'll be looking at today. Either way, the scrolls back then were arranged as two sets of 50 scrolls. In each set, these 50 scrolls were divided into 5 chapters, each consisting of 10 scrolls. Each scroll was made of a precious metal, namely gold or platinum, made flexible like paper with silvery letters floating upon the surface. So when a potential reader opens up one of these magnificent creations, each time a page was read, new knowledge would appear. This allowed the scroll to contain much, much more information than its small size should have allowed. It was essentially the distillation of magic theory, something that could have filled hundreds of tomes, all contained on a single scroll. So, if you were in possession of these items and wanted to learn more about a particular topic, all you had to do was pick up the matching chapter and simply look at the scroll, and the Nether Scroll would do the rest. And when a reader had gained sufficient understanding, rereading the same scroll would provide additional knowledge and information. In fact, from what I understand, there didn't seem to be any limit to the amount of information one scroll could potentially contain. The information wasn't endless, mind you. It still had to have been recorded onto the scroll in the first place, which begs the question, where did they come from, and who recorded all of that lore in the first place? Well, to answer that, we have to go back. Way, way back. Long ago, back through the mists of history, there existed a period of time known to the sages as the Days of Thunder. The Days of Thunder began approximately 35,000 years ago, when the majority of the glaciers left by the cooling of Abir Toral's oceans began to recede. After having retreated for many years, the glaciers finally revealed a supercontinent that would eventually be called Boros. This was a single massive continent that contained all of the land masses we know today, except they were all conjoined together. Life then bloomed on this landmass in the form of the creator races and the ancient ape-like ancestors of us humans. The first of these creator races are known today as the Saruk, and they were the ancestors to nearly all of the reptilian races we have in this day and age. Now, I won't deviate from our tale, but know that each of these creator races are worthy of their own entries, but for now, I'll just cover the pertinent bits. At around negative 30,000 DR, the Saruk were exploring the nature of magic, and they sought to gather all magical knowledge from their vast empire's borders into one location in order to consolidate their arcane power. This effort spawned its own secret society, the Beatith. While not much is known about them, we do know that their sole purpose was to study primitive magics and try to record them. And it's said that the Nether Scrolls were the means these sages used to do exactly that. This secret society extended way beyond the Saruk. In fact, it's believed they lasted up until the last of the great first empires fell, lasting through the Saruk, the Batrachi, and the Eri. And truthfully, for all we know, they could still be at work today. It certainly wouldn't be the strangest thing to have ever happened in the realms. Either way, this society forged the items we know as the Nether Scrolls, imbuing them with thousands of years of primitive magic theory. One can only imagine what secrets they could still hold to this day. However, after being created, history seems to lose track of them until the year negative 3,533 DR. When a Netherese human that went by the moniker of Finder discovered them amid some vast ruins. This site was called Arivandar, and it was an ancient Sun Elf kingdom that had long since fallen during the Fifth Crown War, which were a set of 5 primary conflicts involving the great elven kingdoms of the age. But who are these Netherese, you may ask? Well, I can assure you they'll be getting their own entry in due course, but suffice it to say, Netheril is, at least in my opinion, the most influential empire in the history of the world. Once they laid hands on this trove of mystical knowledge, the scrolls provided a huge leap forward in Netherese spellcraft, which they favored over the magic they had learned from the elves. See, at the time, the early Netherese were being instructed by a nearby clan of elves known as the Irlani in the ways of magic. However, after stumbling upon these priceless scrolls, the Netherese all but abandoned their previous tutors and simply used the scrolls alone. It's said, in the following 200 years, the power of the Netherese arcanists increased by leaps and bounds. For example, shortly after finding the scrolls, a talented young mage named Congenio Ioun would go on to create what is believed to be the very first magical protection device that was called, well, an Ioun stone, of course. Notably, some sages believe the Netherese might have even had some help translating the scrolls. Help that came in the form of an enigmatic being known only as the Terraseer. About a century after finding the scrolls, he arrived in Netheril and began aiding its people with the translation and understanding of many of the scrolls. And I've heard some of my colleagues claim that this Terraseer was actually none other than a vastly powerful Saruk lord who had gone through the process to become a powerful lich, allowing them to survive the downfall of their ancient race. The Netherese, in fact, used the knowledge pulled directly from the scrolls to craft what was called the Mythallar, a magical device that resembled a crystal ball but was absolutely massive at 150 feet in diameter. The Mythallar would allow the Netherese arcanists to create what one might call a quasi-magical item without draining the life force of the creator. As you might imagine, the Netherese would take full advantage of this in practically every road, every home, every shop you could find these items, whether they be simple streetlights to a magical contraption that would allow them running water and plumbing. Rumor actually has it that this would go on to crash their economy due to the amount of these quasi-magical items flooding the market, which could be bought for a pittance compared to the quote, real magical items. Besides these creature comforts, the Netherese would also utilize the Mythallar to create the grand flying cities their empire would come to be known for. And if you aren't familiar with them, I'll simply say that the most powerful Netherese arcanists would quite literally shear the entire top of a mountain, flip it upside down, and build their enclaves upon the flat plain. It must have been a sight to behold. But time passed, and after 400 years of constant study by the arcanists of Netheril, it's said that the elves of Corminthir somehow managed to steal a set and secret it away back to Corminthor, which was, of course, their ancient capital, which also went by the name of the City of Song. Shortly thereafter, they were transformed, as mentioned earlier, into the Golden Grove of Hidden Knowledge. The remaining history of these artifacts consists of them changing hands over and over, stolen by rogues primarily, or sealed within crypts never to be seen again in many cases. By the year -664 DR, all the scrolls had been stolen from their Netherese keepers, and a few hundred years later, Netheril had fallen in spectacular fashion. Now, I wouldn't say it was the scrolls' fault. In fact, it was primarily a mage named Karsus. And yes, that name might sound familiar, as it should, and we'll be sure to cover that figure in due time. But here we are. That's the end of Netheril. Now, that isn't the full history of the scrolls. They changed hands many more times, whether it be given to another sage, sent to another city, or even sent to agents of Mystra for safekeeping. As the years went by, cities rose and fell, but the scrolls always remained, ever willing to pass down their wisdom to all who would gaze upon their golden pages. Which brings us full circle, back to the question of whether or not these wondrous artifacts can be considered influential, and I hope you can see why I chose this as the single most influential item, or set of items, in the history of the realms. Can you imagine what our spellcraft might look like today were it not for these Nether Scrolls? Would you still be using ancient elven magic the Netherese were being taught by the Irlani? Would they have even wanted to or been able to continue teaching our ancestors after the Crown Wars? It's said that every single practicing mage relies on at least some shreds of knowledge directly pulled from the Nether Scrolls, giving them the power to shape the world around them for good or ill. Thanks for being here. I'm so happy to be back at this after a few years. I guess I should do the YouTuber thing. If you think I've provided any value, go ahead and subscribe and click the bell if you want. I don't like giving my students homework. Just know that it would mean a lot to me. Also, Happy New Year's to everyone. I hope 2026 goes well for everyone, so be safe, take care, and happy trails.